Imagine a silent room deep beneath the Tower of London. The air is cold, thick with the weight of centuries. In the dim light, a glass case glows softly. Inside it, the crown jewels shimmer with almost otherworldly brilliance. Each gem seems alive, breathing, whispering stories of power, betrayal, and glory. Now picture this. It's the year 1649. The English Civil War has torn the nation apart, and King Charles I has just been executed. Soldiers march through the tower's vaults with hammers and chisels. They melt down golden scepters. They tear precious stones from crowns that once touched the heads of kings and queens. For the first time in 1,000 years, the symbols of monarchy, the crown jewels, are destroyed. And yet they return. They are reborn with the restoration of Charles II, reforged to represent the eternal endurance of royal power. This is not just a tale about glittering stones and gold, it's about identity, myth, and the strange magnetism of monarchy. Britain's royal jewelry tells the story of a nation's rise and transformation, how an island kingdom projected its might, justified its divine right, and fashioned beauty into a symbol of political eternity. For centuries, these jewels have been more than ornaments. They are instruments of statecraft, tools of legitimacy, and witnesses to every triumph and tragedy of the British crown. From coronations to imperial conquests, from political upheaval to romantic scandals, the jewels have always been there, silent but unyielding, carrying history in every facet. But behind their beauty lies something darker, questions of conquest, exploitation, and power. Many of the most famous gems, such as the Koh-i-Noor diamond or the Cullinan stones, were not simply gifts. They were taken, negotiated, or claimed as spoils of empire. And yet, their story fascinates us still. Perhaps because these jewels, locked in glass and legend, reflect something deeply human. Our desire for permanence, for symbols that outlast our fragile lives. Over the next hour, we'll travel through time, from medieval abbeys to Victorian palaces, from Indian mines to African frontiers, and finally to the dazzling modern ceremonies that still captivate millions. We'll uncover how each gem, each crown, each scepter tells a chapter of Britain's unfolding drama, a saga of glory, greed, faith, and beauty. So, sit back and imagine the glimmer of gold catching candlelight, the soft rustle of silk robes, the echo of trumpets announcing a new sovereign. Because this is not just the story of royal jewelry, it is the story of Great Britain itself. Long before the Tower of London guarded its glittering treasures, the earliest English monarchs wore crowns that were far humbler, but no less meaningful. In the 9th and 10th centuries, when kings like Alfred the Great and Aethelstan ruled, the crown was not yet a symbol of empire. It was a Christian emblem, a circle of sanctity rather than sovereignty. These first crowns were often made of simple metal, sometimes adorned with a few precious stones, donated by noble families or the church. Yet to wear one was to carry the burden of divine authority, the belief that the monarch ruled not by human agreement, but by God's will. Coronations took place in sacred spaces, and the anointing of a king mirrored the anointing of a priest. The crown was both a political statement and a holy relic. By the time of William the Conqueror's coronation in 1066, this symbolism had hardened into ritual. The Norman kings brought with them a taste for grandeur. Gold, imported from Byzantium and beyond, began to appear in English regalia. A new crown was fashioned, heavier, more ornate, lined with velvet and fur, a declaration of legitimacy for a foreign ruler who had taken the throne by force. And so the crown evolved into a weapon of image. When you saw the king wearing it, you weren't just seeing a ruler, you were seeing the embodiment of the nation itself. To question the crown was to question the order of heaven and earth. During the medieval centuries, the regalia became ever more elaborate. Chronicles describe crowns encrusted with sapphires, rubies, and pearls, often passed from one monarch to another, remade and refitted to suit each reign's fashion and fortune. Kings like Henry III and Edward I expanded the symbolism further, commissioning scepters, orbs, and ceremonial swords. Each object was a metaphor: the orb for the world under divine rule, the scepter for justice and command, the sword for protection and divine authority. Yet few of these early treasures survive. Wars, plagues, and political strife consumed them. Gold was melted to pay soldiers. Gems were pried out to fund crusades. The medieval crown jewels were fluid, changing, even mortal, much like the kings who wore them. Still, something extraordinary was happening. The English crown was becoming an institution beyond the individual. Whether a weak king or a warrior queen sat on the throne, the regalia stood for continuity. The crown endured, even when dynasties fell. By the 15th century, as the Wars of the Roses drenched the land in blood, rival houses of Lancaster and York both fought to possess not just the throne, but the jewels themselves. Whoever controlled them could claim legitimacy. They weren't simply ornaments, they were evidence, proof that God had chosen you. When Henry VII finally triumphed at Bosworth in 1485, uniting the warring houses under the Tudor rose, he inherited not only a fragile peace but a broken treasury. He ordered new regalia to be made, brighter, bolder, symbols of renewal. Under the Tudors, the idea of royal display reached new heights. Because in their hands, jewelry became more than tradition, it became propaganda. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, he inherited more than a kingdom. He inherited a stage. And on that stage, every jewel, every ruby-studded collar, and pearl-encrusted cap was a line in the script of power. The Tudors understood something revolutionary. That spectacle could rule hearts as effectively as armies. England was emerging from the medieval world into an age of Renaissance display, and Henry VIII made himself its shining centerpiece. His jewels were not only beautiful, they were strategic. Portraits by Hans Holbein show him standing like a fortress, his clothing a fortress of gems, chains, and gold thread. His wealth gleamed as loudly as his authority, but jewels also became entangled in faith and rebellion. When Henry broke from the Catholic Church and founded the Church of England, he seized the monasteries and their treasures. Chalices, reliquaries, and sacred vessels were melted down, refashioned into royal ornaments. What had once served God now served the king. The regalia of England became the regalia of defiance, a dazzling proclamation that no earthly power, not even the Pope, could rival the English crown. His daughter Elizabeth I inherited that vision and perfected it. If Henry had used jewelry as power, Elizabeth made it into poetry. The Virgin Queen wrapped herself in layers of symbolic beauty, pearls for purity, rubies for majesty, diamonds for eternity. Every portrait of her was a coded message to her subjects and rivals alike. The Armada portrait, painted after her triumph over Spain in 1588, shows her hand resting on a globe, her dress glittering with celestial jewels, a declaration that the British Empire was destined to rule the seas and the stars. For Elizabeth, jewelry was armor. Beneath the shimmer was strategy. As a woman ruling alone in a man's world, she used adornment as diplomacy, seduction, and strength. Her jewels became her voice, and she wielded them masterfully. By the end of the Tudor era, royal jewelry had evolved from sacred relics to instruments of political theatre. The crown jewels of the time dazzled with Renaissance craftsmanship, featuring emeralds from South America, diamonds from India, and gold from Africa. The first hints of a global empire taking shape through conquest and trade. But the glittering splendor concealed deep cracks. Beneath the gold and gemstones lay the weight of religious division, rebellion, and royal debt. When Elizabeth died childless in 1603, the crown passed to the Scottish King James VI, now James I of England, uniting two realms and two treasuries. The regalia crossed a threshold once again, from the Renaissance into the dawn of empire. The Stuarts inherited not only a crown, but a question. Could such symbols of divine rule survive in an age when people were beginning to question divine right itself? They would soon find out in Fire and Blood. When James I took the English throne in 1603, uniting England and Scotland under one monarch, he dreamed of harmony and divine unity. His coronation, lavish and resplendent, featured the Tudor regalia, those same glittering symbols that had dazzled the court of Elizabeth. To James, they were proof of divine favour, a heavenly endorsement of his right to rule both crowns. But beneath the splendour, England was shifting. New ideas were stirring, ideas of liberty, of Parliament's rights, of the limits of monarchy. The age of unquestioned kingship was dying, and the crown jewels, once sacred, began to symbolise tyranny for many. James's son, Charles I, inherited both the jewels and the peril. He too believed in the divine right of kings. He too stood crowned beneath the golden orb, believing that he ruled by heaven's hand. But his people no longer agreed. When civil war broke out in 1642, the crown jewels themselves became a target, the visible embodiment of royal arrogance. As the monarchy crumbled, Parliament sought to erase its symbols. When Charles I was executed in 1649, the regalia were condemned as relics of oppression. A detailed inventory was made, listing every crown, scepter, and sword. Then came the destruction. Gold was melted and minted into coins. Gems were pried from their settings, sold to merchants, scattered across Europe. Even the ancient crown of St. Edward, used in coronations for centuries, was hammered into fragments. Only a few items, like the 12th century coronation spoon, miraculously survived. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the monarchy itself ceased to exist. The throne stood empty, the regalia gone. England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell, and the glitter of royalty vanished from public life. But the idea of the crown, like the idea of monarchy, proved indestructible. When the Restoration came in 1660 and Charles II returned from exile, he found a kingdom hungry for ceremony once more. The people who had beheaded a king now longed for the pageantry of kingship. Charles understood the power of spectacle better than any ruler before him. He ordered a complete reconstruction of the crown jewels, a magnificent act of political theatre. The goldsmith Sir Robert Viner was commissioned to create new crowns, sceptres, and orbs from scratch, using fresh gold, pearls, and precious stones imported from across the empire. The result was breathtaking. The St. Edward's crown, modelled after the lost medieval original, was crafted in solid gold, set with nearly 450 gemstones, rubies, sapphires, amethysts, garnets, and tourmalines. It was heavy, almost 6 pounds, a physical weight symbolising the burden of kingship. When Charles II wore it at his coronation in Westminster Abbey, the message was clear. The monarchy had risen from the ashes. The jewels were reborn, and through them, the nation found its continuity restored. The Restoration crown jewels were more than replacements. They were reinventions. Their style reflected the age of Baroque magnificence. Their materials reflected the reach of empire. They announced to Europe that England was once again a kingdom of splendour, stability, and divine favour. Yet, even in their glitter, the scars of the past lingered. The new regalia carried within them a silent memory of the old, of the hammers that had smashed their predecessors, of a king who had died for wearing them. The jewels had been destroyed once, but now they gleamed brighter than ever, not just as ornaments, but as the phoenix of monarchy itself. By the early 18th century, Britain had emerged from the storms of revolution and restoration as a new kind of kingdom, powerful, prosperous, and increasingly global. When the crown passed to George I in 1714, marking the beginning of the Hanoverian dynasty, a new chapter opened in the story of royal jewelry. The regalia were no longer just symbols of divine right, they became emblems of imperial ambition and enlightened wealth. The Georgian monarchs, German by birth but British by destiny, saw jewelry as the visual proof of stability. They needed to project majesty to a skeptical people who viewed them as foreigners. And so the crown jewels and the personal collections of the royal family swelled with diamonds, pearls, and gemstones, imported from far corners of the empire. London's booming trade with India, Africa, and the Caribbean filled the treasuries of merchants and monarchs alike. Diamonds from Golconda, emeralds from Colombia, and gold from West Africa began to appear in royal ornaments. The British crown was no longer forged only from English soil. It glittered with the spoils and riches of an expanding world. The state crown of George I, created in 1714, embodied this new era. It was lighter and more elegant than its predecessors, designed in the refined style of the Enlightenment. Yet every sparkle of it carried the echo of empire. Behind the beauty lay the unseen labor of miners and merchants, sailors and slaves, the invisible hands that built Britain's wealth. By the reign of George III, the world had changed again. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society, and the monarchy itself was under pressure. The American colonies were lost, and revolution raged in France. To survive, Britain's kings leaned on ceremony, on the timeless authority of the crown and its jewels. George III, often remembered for his madness, was deeply fascinated by the symbolism of kingship. He had the old crowns refurbished, their stones reset, their gold repolished. He believed that the physical continuity of the regalia mirrored the moral continuity of the nation. "The crown must not fade," he once said, "for if it fades, so too does the kingdom." Yet in private, even as the state regalia shone at coronations, the royal family's personal jewels became more intimate, more sentimental. Queens and princesses wore miniature portraits framed in diamonds, lockets containing hair, or brooches set with pearls, symbols of love, loyalty, and lineage. Jewelry was not just for display anymore, it was for identity. The Georgian era also saw the rise of jewelers as artists. Firms like Garrard and Company, who would later become official crown jewelers, began crafting pieces that were both technically perfect and politically meaningful. Their creations blended refinement with grandeur, appealing to both royal taste and public admiration. By the late 18th century, the British monarchy had perfected the balance between Old World sanctity and New World spectacle. The jewels were at once ancient and modern, sacred and fashionable. And though revolutions toppled monarchies across Europe, the crown of Britain gleamed on, unshaken, untarnished, eternal. But soon, one woman would redefine royal jewelry forever, transforming it from a symbol of mere power into an empire of emotion, industry, and immortality. Her name would become synonymous with diamonds themselves. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, Britain stood at the height of transformation. Steamships crossed oceans, factories smoked over sprawling cities, and the sun never set on the empire. Yet its new monarch was just 18 years old, small, soft-spoken, and untested. How could such a young woman command the loyalty of millions? The answer, in part, lay in symbolism, and the jewels became her most powerful instrument. Victoria understood instinctively that the crown was not merely an object of gold and stones. It was a mirror of monarchy itself. Every gem had to tell a story, every sparkle a message of continuity, love, and strength. Her reign would redefine not only what royal jewelry looked like, but what it meant. From the very start, Victoria used jewelry as a language of feeling. She wore a simple diamond heart brooch given to her by Prince Albert on their wedding day in 1840, a piece she would treasure for life. Albert himself took a deep interest in design, introducing modern, romantic styles to royal jewelry. Under his guidance, the royal collection expanded dramatically, blending personal sentiment with imperial symbolism. Yet it was during Victoria's reign that the empire's reach and its moral questions crystallized in stone. The most famous of all, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, came into British hands in 1849 after the annexation of the Punjab. Once celebrated as a mountain of light in India, it was surrendered to Queen Victoria as a trophy of empire. Set first into a brooch and later into crowns, the Koh-i-Noor became both a dazzling centerpiece and a source of controversy that endures to this day. For the Victorians, it was a sign of global dominance, proof that Britain ruled not only nations, but nature itself. For others, it was a silent witness to conquest, its beauty shadowed by its history. Still, Victoria's jewels captured the imagination of the age. At the Great Exhibition of 1851, which Albert organized to celebrate industrial progress, the royal jewels dazzled millions of visitors from around the world. They represented a new kind of monarchy, not aloof and divine, but human, industrious, and imperial. After Albert's death in 1861, Victoria retreated into mourning, dressing in black for the rest of her life. Yet even her mourning became a form of symbolism. Her jewelry turned somber but no less meaningful: jet necklaces, onyx cameos, lockets containing Albert's portrait. She transformed grief into ritual and jewelry into memory. In doing so, she reshaped the monarchy's image. The crown jewels, once symbols of divine rule, now spoke of human emotion, continuity, and moral duty. The queen who had ruled an empire also became the widow who wore her love on her sleeve in the glitter of her gems. When she celebrated her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, the jewels of empire returned in full splendor. Diamonds from South Africa now adorned new tiaras and necklaces, each one representing the farthest reaches of the British realm. By the time of her death in 1901, Queen Victoria had turned jewelry into a language of nationhood. The jewels no longer belonged merely to the monarchy, they belonged to the people's imagination. They told a story not only of wealth and conquest, but of love, endurance, and identity. And when her son, Edward VII, inherited the throne, he inherited not only the empire, but the full radiance of its symbols, ready to shine in a new century of spectacle and change. When King Edward VII ascended the throne in 1901, the world was changing faster than ever before. The industrial might of Britain was unrivaled, the empire spanned the globe, and London had become a glittering capital of power and culture. Edward was no austere monarch, he was a bon vivant, a man who loved society, ceremony, and style. And with him, royal jewelry entered a new golden age of elegance. Unlike his mother, whose reign had been marked by moral severity and mourning, Edward embraced display. His coronation in 1902 was an unapologetic celebration of empire, and the crown jewels gleamed brighter than they had in centuries. Jewelers across Europe were commissioned to design pieces that matched the spirit of the new century. Intricate, delicate, and dazzling. At the center of this era stood one extraordinary stone, the Cullinan diamond. Discovered in South Africa in 1905, it was the largest rough diamond ever found, weighing over 3,000 carats. Its presentation to the king was both a gift and a political gesture, a brilliant symbol of imperial unity. When the stone was cut, it yielded 9 magnificent diamonds and dozens of smaller fragments, each destined to become part of the royal regalia. The largest, Cullinan the Faye, also called the Great Star of Africa, was set into the sovereign's scepter with cross. Weighing over 530 carats, it became the single largest clear-cut diamond in the world. Its presence transformed the scepter from a medieval emblem of power into a modern icon of global empire. The second largest stone, Cullinan II, was mounted into the imperial state crown, glittering just below the Black Prince's ruby and the St. Edward's sapphire. These jewels weren't merely decorative, they were declarations. The British Empire was at its zenith, and its monarch wore its wealth upon his brow. Edward also encouraged a new style of court jewelry, Edwardian jewelry, characterized by platinum settings, lace-like designs, and light, airy elegance. Diamonds sparkled in tiaras, necklaces, and brooches worn at glittering balls and state banquets. Where Victoria's jewels had been heavy and emotional, Edward's were refined and theatrical, a mirror of a confident nation basking in its power. But beneath this brilliance, the world was stirring. New political movements were rising. Industrial progress was reshaping class structures. The empire, though vast, carried cracks of dissent. Yet, for the moment, the crown shone without a shadow. Edward's reign was brief, only 9 years, but its visual legacy endured. His love for grandeur and modern design permanently influenced the aesthetic of royal jewelry. The Cullinan stones, especially, came to define the monarchy's image in the 20th century. When Edward died in 1910, the empire mourned a king who had personified its glittering facade. His son, George V, inherited both the throne and the dazzling burden of its symbols, just as Europe was heading toward a storm that no diamond could outshine. When King George V came to the throne in 1910, the world still glittered with the elegance of the Edwardian era. But that shine was about to be tested. Within a few short years, the First World War would rip across Europe, changing everything, including how the monarchy saw itself and how its symbols were understood. George V was a very different monarch from his father. Where Edward VII had loved pageantry and lavish display, George was reserved, disciplined, and aware that the monarchy's survival depended not on excess, but on dignity and unity. He wore the crown with solemnity, not spectacle. When war broke out in 1914, the crown jewels were locked away in the Tower of London under strict guard. The empire's resources were being poured into the war effort, and the monarchy needed to appear close to the people, not distant in diamonds. Official portraits of George and Queen Mary still featured the regalia, but public appearances became more subdued. The dazzling tiaras and necklaces were set aside in favor of modest brooches and simple decorations. And yet, the symbolism of the jewels did not disappear. It deepened. During wartime, they became reminders of stability in a world unraveling. When soldiers marched into the trenches, they sang songs about king and country. The crown, even unseen, was the anchor of their national identity. There was another, quieter shift. In 1917, amid fierce anti-German sentiment, George V changed the royal family's name from House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to House of Windsor, severing its German associations. Even the regalia took on new meaning. What had once linked the monarchy to European courts now became a distinctly British symbol, pure, national, and carefully guarded. Behind the scenes, Queen Mary played a crucial role. She was not only a consort, but a passionate collector and restorer of royal jewelry. She acquired pieces from fallen aristocrats, restored heirlooms, and designed new settings for old gems. She understood that the jewels were part of Britain's story. Their continuity would speak when politics could not. At the war's end in 1918, the world had changed forever. Monarchies across Europe fell, in Germany, Austria, Russia. Only a few remained, and Britain's was one of them. In that fragile moment, the crown jewels became more than a symbol of power. They became a symbol of survival. When George V wore the imperial state crown at the state opening of Parliament after the war, the weight of its gems was heavier than ever, not in carats, but in meaning. The Koh-i-Noor sparkled beneath the gaslights of Westminster, and the Cullinan stones flashed like captured stars. But what they represented was no longer imperial arrogance. It was endurance, continuity. The monarchy had survived not because of its wealth, but because of its ability to adapt its image. The jewels, too, had adapted, from grand theatre to quiet reassurance. But soon, that delicate balance would be shaken again. A king would fall not by war, but by love. And the jewels, once again, would find themselves at the centre of scandal. The 1930s were supposed to be a time of cautious stability for the British monarchy. After the storms of war, the crown stood as a steady, glittering anchor in a rapidly changing world. But history often strikes from unexpected angles. In January 1936, King George V died. The crown, the literal and symbolic weight of 1,000 years of monarchy, passed to his eldest son, Edward VIII. Charismatic, modern, and dazzling in the public eye, Edward embodied a new age. He was stylish, confident, and adored. But behind the polished surface, he was carrying a secret that would shake the monarchy to its core. Edward was in love with Wallis Simpson, an American socialite and divorcee. To him, she was his world. To the establishment, she was a scandal. A king was expected to marry a suitable consort to embody duty, stability, and tradition, the very ideals reflected in the crown jewels. Instead, Edward wanted to follow his heart. As his relationship became public, the crisis deepened. The Church of England opposed their union, Parliament stood firm, and his ministers warned him. He could keep the throne or Wallis, but not both. And then came one of the most dramatic moments in modern royal history. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII abdicated the throne. In a radio broadcast, his voice trembled as he declared he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the woman I love. The crown, the imperial state crown, the orb, the scepter, never truly belonged to him. No coronation ever took place. The jewels remained locked in the tower, untouched, waiting for a king who could wear them. But the story didn't end there. Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, and Wallis married in 1937. Though he left the throne behind, he built his own world of jewels, not of crowns and scepters, but of personal luxury. Wallis became famous for her extraordinary jewelry collection, filled with emeralds, sapphires, and diamonds commissioned from the finest houses of Europe. One of the most striking pieces was a Cartier bracelet with diamond panthers and ruby hearts, a romantic language written in gemstones. Their private jewels were glamorous, modern, and deeply personal, but they also became symbols of something else: the jewels of a king without a crown. Back in London, the monarchy was forced to recover quickly. The crown was passed to George VI, Edward's shy, stammering younger brother. Unlike Edward, George never sought the spotlight. But it would fall upon him anyway. For the next decade would bring war, fire, and one of the greatest tests the monarchy would ever face. And once again, the crown jewels would play their silent role, not as ornaments of luxury, but as emblems of unity in the face of darkness. When King George VI took the throne in 1936, the crown jewels rested in the Tower of London, symbols of monarchy polished by centuries, but now facing a world on the brink of catastrophe. The new king had never expected to rule. Shy, gentle, and plagued by a stammer, he suddenly carried the weight of empire on his shoulders. But history would make him a symbol of resilience. When war erupted in 1939, Britain once again stood in the shadow of peril. This time, the threat was not just to the throne, but to the very physical survival of the regalia itself. The Blitz would rain fire on London. Nothing, not even the jewels, was safe. A secret plan was drawn up in the early days of the war. The most precious elements of the crown jewels, including the Koh-i-Noor diamond and the Black Prince's ruby, were carefully removed from their settings. Under cover of night, they were taken not to a bank or a distant vault, but to a hidden chamber deep beneath Windsor Castle. There, in a room that few knew existed, the gems were placed in small metal boxes and buried beneath a trapdoor, protected not just from bombs, but from the possibility of invasion. Even the young Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen, was not told exactly where they were. Meanwhile, London burned. The Tower of London itself was damaged during the Blitz, its windows shattered, its ancient stones scarred. But the jewels, those silent witnesses to centuries of upheaval, remained untouched. While the gems lay hidden, their image still shone. The King and Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, refused to flee London, even during the heaviest bombings. Their decision inspired the nation. When the royal family appeared in public, the Queen often wore modest pieces of jewellery, carefully chosen, not opulent tiaras or great necklaces, but brooches and pearls that spoke of solidarity, not superiority. In this era, the crown jewels took on a new kind of power. They were invisible, but their very existence reminded the British people of something unshakable. If the monarchy survived, so did the country. When the war ended in 1945, the jewels emerged from their hiding place, still gleaming, a little dusty perhaps, but intact. They had outlasted the Blitz, outlasted Hitler, outlasted fear itself. And the monarchy, strengthened by the king's quiet courage, stood taller than ever. George VI had not been a glamorous monarch, but he had been a steady one. In the eyes of his people, that was far more valuable than diamonds. But even as the old world was rebuilt, a new one was rising. The empire was fading, television was transforming the way people saw their rulers, and a young woman was preparing to wear the most famous crown in the world. The next chapter of the crown jewels would not be written in secret bunkers or smoky palaces, but in front of millions of eyes, live and in colour. It was a grey, rainy morning in London, June 2nd, 1953, when the doors of Westminster Abbey opened to reveal one of the most dazzling spectacles of the 20th century. The world, still healing from war, turned its eyes to Britain. For the first time in history, a coronation would be broadcast live on television, and more than 20 million people would watch as a young woman walked toward a destiny glittering with gold and diamonds. Queen Elizabeth II, just 27 years old, entered the Abbey wearing a simple white gown embroidered with symbols of the Commonwealth. But all eyes were not on the dress, they were on the regalia that surrounded her, the ancient, almost mythical crown jewels of Britain. On the altar lay the St. Edward's crown, the heaviest and holiest of them all. Forged in 1661 after the restoration of the monarchy, it had been used for centuries to crown sovereigns. Solid gold, set with 444 semi-precious stones, it weighs more than 2 kilograms, a literal weight of history. It had not been worn since 1937 at the coronation of her father, George VI. Elizabeth approached the throne with calm, steady steps. The moment came. The crown was lowered onto her head, its gold pressing against her brow. Trumpets sounded, cannons roared. In that instant, the world witnessed not just a young queen being crowned, but the ancient ritual of monarchy reborn in the modern age. The symbolism was immense. Britain's empire was already beginning to dissolve, but the Commonwealth of Nations was rising in its place. The crown she wore was no longer just a symbol of conquest, it was being reimagined as a symbol of unity. After the ceremony, the Queen exchanged the St. Edward's crown for the Imperial State Crown, the piece most associated with her long reign. Lighter and more practical, it sparkled with some of the most famous stones in the world. The Cullinan II diamond, also called the second star of Africa, gleaming like frozen light. The Black Prince's ruby, glowing deep red at the centre of the front cross. The St. Edward's sapphire, said to have once belonged to an 11th century king. The pearls of Queen Elizabeth I, linking two queens separated by nearly 4 centuries. The imperial state crown was not just an object, it was a time machine, a physical archive of monarchy. Each gem carried a story, each story a moment, each moment a piece of the British identity. But what made this coronation different from all others was its reach. Millions who had never stepped foot in London now felt part of the ceremony. The jewels, once seen only by courtiers and aristocrats, now glittered through television screens across continents. For the first time, the crown belonged not just to Britain, but to the world's gaze. Elizabeth II would wear that crown for the next 7 decades, becoming the longest reigning monarch in British history. The regalia would travel with her through wars, jubilees, crises, and celebrations. They would age with her, evolving from imperial emblems into global symbols of continuity. But the world she inherited in 1953 would not stay the same. The empire would crumble, new nations would rise, and the monarchy itself would face unprecedented scrutiny. And through it all, the crown jewels would remain, unchanged yet constantly reinterpreted, the eternal witnesses of a changing world. By the 1960s, the Britain that had crowned Queen Elizabeth II was already transforming. The empire, once the largest the world had ever known, was shrinking rapidly. Former colonies were declaring independence, new nations were emerging, and the old idea of imperial power was giving way to something entirely different, the Commonwealth. And through all this geopolitical upheaval, the crown jewels stayed exactly where they had always been, in the Tower of London, unmoved, untouched, immutable. But their meaning was changing. Once the gems in the crown were seen as trophies of conquest, diamonds from South Africa, rubies from Burma, sapphires from Ceylon, gold from Africa. They were the physical proof of empire, glowing on the head of a sovereign who ruled over 1/4 of the world's land. Now they became something else, symbols of shared history, however complicated and painful. When Elizabeth visited newly independent nations, the crown itself did not travel, but its image preceded her, a glittering emblem that linked the Commonwealth together for better or worse. The Queen adapted to this new reality with quiet precision. Instead of wearing heavy coronation pieces on foreign tours, she often wore lighter tiaras and brooches, carefully chosen to honor each nation she visited. She understood that the crown could no longer be a symbol of domination, it had to be a symbol of diplomacy. One of the most striking examples of this transformation came during her tour of India in 1961. She did not wear the Koh-i-Noor diamond, a stone whose history is deeply tied to colonial conquest, out of sensitivity to its contested legacy. It was a quiet but powerful acknowledgement that the meaning of the jewels had changed. Meanwhile, the imperial state crown became inseparable from the Queen's image at home. Each year at the state opening of Parliament, Elizabeth would arrive in ceremonial robes, the crown placed carefully on her head. As she delivered the speech outlining her government's plans, a political act she herself had no hand in writing, the jewels around her spoke of something deeper than policy. They spoke of continuity. This ritual became a kind of national theatre. The jewels didn't need to change to stay relevant. They only needed to be seen, to remind a rapidly modernizing Britain that its history was still present, tangible, and glittering. At the same time, the jewels themselves became objects of fascination for millions of ordinary people. With growing tourism, visitors from around the world came to see the crown jewels in the Tower of London. Queues stretched long, and glass cases gleamed under careful lighting. No longer the private property of monarchs, these treasures became part of Britain's public identity, like an open-air museum of royal power. But beneath this public spectacle, another tension lingered: the question of ownership. As nations like India and South Africa gained independence, some began to ask whether certain jewels, most famously the Koh-i-Noor, should be returned. The crown, once unassailable, had become part of a global conversation about history, empire, and justice. And yet, despite this shifting political landscape, the jewels endured. Their stories could be contested, but their presence was undeniable. They no longer proclaimed conquest, they bore witness to it and to everything that followed. The Commonwealth era had turned the crown jewels from symbols of empire into symbols of legacy, complex, controversial, and powerful. And as the decades rolled on, their glitter would illuminate moments not just of statecraft and diplomacy, but of personal triumph and national heartbreak. By the 1970s and 1980s, the crown jewels had settled into a new rhythm, no longer tools of conquest, but icons of ceremony. They appeared not on battlefields or in the negotiations of empire, but in the carefully choreographed moments when the monarchy met its people, and there was no moment more perfectly suited to display the monarchy's brilliance than a royal wedding. Royal weddings were not just personal unions, they were national events. When Princess Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten in 1947, just after the Second World War, she wore the Queen Mary fringe tiara, made of diamonds set in platinum, borrowed from her mother. It was both a symbol of continuity and of hope, a glittering promise to a nation emerging from rubble. Decades later, in 1981, the world witnessed another spectacle, the marriage of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer. This was more than a ceremony. It was a global broadcast watched by hundreds of millions. And at its heart was the Spencer tiara, a delicate, romantic diamond piece worn by Diana as she walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. Though it was not part of the crown jewels themselves, its image became inseparable from the idea of the royal family. Jewelry had become the bridge between monarchy and the public, the detail that turned ritual into memory. The crown jewels themselves emerged with full force during jubilees, the great anniversaries of a monarch's reign. For Queen Elizabeth II, these occasions were milestones that spanned the second half of the 20th century and beyond. During the Silver Jubilee in 1977, the Queen wore the imperial state crown for the state opening of Parliament, and her image was replicated on coins, stamps, posters, and television screens around the world. The crown no longer needed to travel, its image was everywhere. During the Golden Jubilee in 2002 and the Diamond Jubilee in 2012, the symbolism deepened. These were no longer just royal milestones, they were collective memories. Millions of people lined the streets, waving flags, taking photographs, gazing up at the royal balcony. The jewels themselves were seen only briefly, but their presence anchored the spectacle. Each time the imperial state crown was carried into Westminster on a velvet cushion, it was treated with almost religious reverence. When placed upon the Queen's head, the room would still. It was as if the weight of centuries gathered in that single, glittering moment. Even outside official ceremonies, royal jewelry played a quiet but profound role in shaping public memory. When the Queen appeared at garden parties, state banquets, or diplomatic receptions, she often wore brooches and tiaras with personal histories, pieces inherited from previous monarchs, gifts from world leaders, or symbols tied to specific places in the Commonwealth. Each piece told a story, though not always out loud. A diamond brooch might have been worn by Queen Victoria at a royal christening. A tiara might have crossed oceans as part of a diplomatic gift. Jewelry became a language, one understood not just by historians, but by the millions who saw these images repeated in newspapers, magazines, and broadcasts. By the turn of the millennium, the crown jewels had become living artifacts, not hidden relics, but active participants in Britain's story. They belonged to ceremonies both grand and intimate, to state power and to personal lives. And as the monarchy stepped into the digital age, these same jewels, forged in empires, carried through wars, crowned in glory, would enter a new kind of arena, the global stage of instant media. The dawn of the 21st century changed everything about how the world saw monarchy. For centuries, the crown jewels had been viewed by only a select few, nobles, courtiers, and foreign dignitaries. Even after the rise of television, their presence was carefully controlled, revealed only on ceremonial occasions. But in the age of global media, images moved faster than any royal carriage. With a single broadcast, a photograph, or a viral headline, the regalia of Britain could circle the world in seconds. It wasn't just about what the jewels symbolized anymore, it was about how they were perceived. The glittering imperial state crown, the sovereign's scepter with cross, and the St. Edward's crown became icons on magazine covers, in documentaries, and even in blockbuster television dramas and films. They appeared in everything from historical reenactments to fashion editorials. People in far-flung corners of the globe who had never visited Britain could instantly recognize their shapes, their silhouettes, even the specific gems that adorned them. This transformation was both powerful and delicate. The jewels were now not just part of Britain's heritage, they were global cultural symbols, floating somewhere between history and legend. Consider the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Its presence in the Queen Mother's crown made it one of the most famous jewels in the world. Its dazzling beauty was undeniable, but so was the complexity of its history. Originating in India and passed through the hands of empires and rulers, the stone's legacy is entwined with colonial conquest. In the age of instant communication, those complexities could no longer be hidden behind velvet curtains. Historians, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens around the world began to debate the legacy of the jewels more openly than ever before. Calls for the return of contested treasures grew louder. Documentaries explored the tangled histories behind each gem. The monarchy, which had long relied on tradition, now found itself at the center of a global conversation about history, power, and identity. At the same time, the jewels continued to captivate popular imagination. When royal events took place, jubilees, weddings, or state occasions, the images of crowns and tiaras would dominate headlines and social feeds. In 2018, during the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, royal jewelry once again became a topic of fascination worldwide. Though the official crown jewels remained in their glass cases, their aura infused every element of the ceremony. And then came a moment that would once again turn the world's eyes toward the Tower of London and Westminster Abbey, the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022. 70 years on the throne. No other British monarch had worn the imperial state crown for so long or so consistently. By this time, the crown was as much a part of her public image as her face itself. Television cameras lingered on the crown's diamond cross, its violet cap, its centuries-old gold frame. Commentators whispered the names of the jewels it carried: the Black Prince's ruby, the Cullinan II, the St. Edward's sapphire. Each one had its own mythos, its own long shadow of history. And yet, in those moments, for millions watching, the details didn't just speak of history, they spoke of continuity. They said, this is what has lasted. Empires had fallen, borders had changed, technology had revolutionized how the world worked. But the crown jewels still gleamed, still carried stories, still commanded awe. But there was an undeniable truth beneath that brilliance. The jewels were not just artifacts of power, they were witnesses. Witnesses to glory and conquest, to loss and change, to an empire's rise and its slow transformation into something else. In the age of media and myth, the jewels had become both treasures and mirrors. Treasures that preserved the past, and mirrors that reflected how the world was changing around them. And their story was not finished, because even the most ancient crowns eventually rest on new heads. The crown jewels have always been older than the people who wear them. Kings and queens come and go, the regalia remains. That is their greatest power and their greatest weight. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, the world paused. For 70 years, the image of the imperial state crown resting upon her head had defined the British monarchy. It had framed her face in countless portraits, broadcasts, and ceremonies. it had crowned a young woman in 1953 and accompanied a stateswoman through 7 decades of global change. But the crown, like history, does not stop. On a grey London morning, the imperial state crown was placed upon her coffin as it lay in Westminster Hall. It gleamed under the vaulted ceiling, catching the light in sharp, solemn flashes. The same jewels that had shone during her coronation now symbolized something very different: the end of an era. Crowds filed past in silence. For many, it was the last time they would see the Queen's crown in this way, not as a symbol of living power, but as a relic of memory. And then, in one of the most quietly moving moments of royal ritual, the crown was lifted from the coffin, a gesture that signified the end of her reign. Then came the next chapter. On May 6, 2023, the world watched another coronation at Westminster Abbey, the crowning of King Charles III. It was a ceremony drenched in centuries of tradition, yet consciously modern. Unlike the vast imperial pageantry of 1953, this coronation was more restrained, reflecting a different age and a different world. But at its centre, as always, were the crown jewels. The St. Edward's crown, used only for coronations, was placed carefully on the king's head by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was the same crown, or rather the same object, that had touched the heads of kings and queens since the 17th century. It had survived wars, revolutions, and empires. And now it crowned a monarch who ruled not over an empire, but over a constitutional monarchy in a modern democracy. Later in the ceremony, the imperial state crown reappeared, signalling the continuation of tradition from one reign to the next. For many watching around the world, this moment felt historic, not just because a new monarch was crowned, but because it showed how the regalia had outlasted entire political systems. But Charles's coronation also highlighted a profound reality. The world had changed. Debates around the Koh-i-Noor diamond, questions of colonial legacy, and discussions about the monarchy's place in contemporary society were louder than ever. Rather than ignore these issues, the new reign seemed aware of them. Certain pieces were carefully chosen, some jewels were avoided, and the tone of the ceremony was one of continuity with acknowledgement, tradition standing beside history, not trying to erase it. This coronation was not just a crowning, it was an act of inheritance, of power, yes, but also of responsibility. The crown jewels are not merely possessions, they are national treasures owned by the state, held in trust for the people, and now they belonged to a new story. King Charles III, stepping into a role defined by centuries of spectacle and symbolism, did not wear the jewels as conquerors once did. He wore them as custodian, not of an empire, but of a living legacy, one that must find its place in the world of the 21st century. The golden orb, the jeweled scepter, the heavy crown, they were as brilliant as ever. But their meaning was no longer fixed in the past. Their future would be shaped by how the nation and the world chose to see them. And for the first time, the crown jewels stood at a crossroads between reverence and re-examination, between tradition and transformation. No jewel in the British royal collection carries a history as charged, as dazzling, or as contested as the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Its name means Mountain of Light, and for centuries it has been both a symbol of power and a source of political tension. The stone's story begins in the Indian subcontinent, long before it ever set foot in Britain. Thought to have been mined in the Golconda region, it passed through the hands of Mughal emperors, Persian shahs, Afghan rulers, and Sikh maharajas. Each transfer was marked by conquest or coercion, never a quiet exchange. It was not simply a jewel, it was a trophy of empires. In 1849, during the era of British colonial expansion, the diamond was taken following the annexation of the Punjab. Official documents called it a gift, but history tells a more complicated tale. The recipient was Queen Victoria, and the diamond arrived in London amid imperial triumphalism. It was displayed at the Great Exhibition of 1851, where thousands of visitors queued to see the fabled jewel under glass. But instead of admiration, many were surprised. The Koh-i-Noor's original Mughal cut didn't sparkle like modern European diamonds. It was later recut in London, drastically reducing its weight but increasing its brilliance. The result was a gem fit not for a conqueror's vault, but for a queen's crown. The stone was mounted into the crown of Queen Alexandra, then transferred to Queen Mary, and finally set into the crown worn by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, at the 1937 coronation. Since then, the Koh-i-Noor has never been worn by a reigning monarch, perhaps because even in earlier decades it carried a quiet, unspoken weight. In the post-colonial era, as former colonies gained independence, the Koh-i-Noor became more than a diamond. It became a symbol of loss, of history seized and never returned. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran have all made formal or informal claims to the jewel at various times. India, in particular, has repeatedly called for its repatriation, arguing that the stone was taken under conditions of coercion and should be returned as a gesture of historical justice. The British government, however, has maintained that the Koh-i-Noor was legally acquired under the terms of the Treaty of Lahore, and that it is now part of the crown jewels held in trust for the nation. The debate is both legal and emotional, and it reveals how a single jewel can hold centuries of unresolved history. When King Charles III was crowned in 2023, the decision was made not to use the crown containing the Koh-i-Noor. Instead, his wife Queen Camilla wore a crown that had been altered to exclude the diamond entirely. It was a quiet but deliberate gesture, an acknowledgement that some jewels are too politically charged to be displayed without consequence. This act didn't end the debate. If anything, it reignited it. Commentators, historians, and activists around the world revisited the stone's history, asking questions not just about the Koh-i-Noor, but about other treasures taken during the empire's expansion. The Koh-i-Noor's brilliance is undeniable, but its power does not come only from the way it refracts light. Its power lies in the way it reflects the past, the complicated, contested, often painful past of empire, conquest, and identity. Whether the diamond ever leaves the Tower of London or not, its story is no longer silent. It speaks through every article, every diplomatic conversation, every museum exhibit that dares to ask, who does history belong to? And in this question lies a truth that extends far beyond a single diamond. The crown jewels are not merely possessions. They are fragments of a global history, stitched together through war, diplomacy, artistry, and power. And as Britain moves deeper into the 21st century, these questions are no longer whispers, they are part of the monarchy's reality. When we admire the crown jewels, it's easy to focus solely on their sparkle, their sheer opulence, and the history they carry. But beneath the glitter lies a story of master craftsmanship, the skill, patience, and ingenuity of generations of artisans who shaped gold, silver, and gemstones into symbols of monarchy. The jewels are not simply assembled, they are engineered for grandeur, durability, and symbolism. Each crown, scepter, and orb is a carefully considered object, designed to convey authority and continuity. Take, for instance, the St. Edward's crown. Forged in 1661 for the coronation of Charles II, the crown is made of solid gold, its frame weighing over 6 pounds. Craftsmen worked the gold into a lattice of arches, encrusted it with hundreds of semi-precious stones, and lined it with crimson velvet. The result is both ceremonial and functional, heavy enough to impress, light enough to be worn briefly during a coronation. Every curve, every setting reflects intentional artistry where aesthetics and symbolism intertwine. Diamonds are another marvel. Many in the collection, like the Cullinan stones, were cut with unparalleled precision. The art of cutting such enormous gems is a story in itself. Each facet must be calculated to maximize brilliance while minimizing weight loss. A single mistake could ruin a diamond worth millions, and the stakes were even higher centuries ago when stones of this size were unique treasures of global origin. Goldsmiths, gem setters, and jewelers were, and remain, technicians of wonder. Firms like Garrard and Company, the crown jewelers for centuries, specialized in this union of artistry and engineering. They restore, repair, and sometimes redesign pieces without compromising historical integrity. A crown that is over 350 years old can, with careful maintenance, shine like new, a testament to the craft. But beyond technique, there is symbolism baked into every choice. Pearls often signify purity, sapphires loyalty, rubies courage, and diamonds invincibility. The placement of each stone is deliberate. Tiaras that curve gracefully across a queen's forehead are designed to capture and reflect light, so that the wearer literally glows during ceremonies. Scepters and orbs, though small enough to be held, are built to suggest weight and authority, their gold and gemstones conveying majesty that transcends speech. Even more fascinating is how the jewels have evolved with technology and taste. Earlier medieval crowns were simpler, heavier, and often used colored glass in place of gemstones. By the Renaissance, innovations in lapidary and goldsmithing allowed greater intricacy and brilliance. And later, Georgian and Victorian craftsmen experimented with platinum and new cuts of diamonds, creating pieces that could sparkle under candlelight and eventually under electric light. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of these jewels is their durability. They have survived revolutions, fires, theft attempts, and centuries of handling. Their preservation is a combination of meticulous craft and historical foresight, a recognition that these objects are more than jewels. They are living archives of monarchy. The crown jewels are also a record of global interconnectedness. Gems were sourced from mines in India, South America, and Africa. Gold and silver came from Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Each jewel is a tangible reminder of the networks of trade, conquest, and artistry that shaped the world, a microcosm of history in gold and stone. To hold a crown is to hold centuries of human skill, ambition, and artistry. To view the crown jewels is to witness the embodiment of human aspiration, captured in a form that is dazzling, durable, and profoundly symbolic. And yet, even as the craftsmanship endures, the story of the jewels is not finished. The next generation of jewelers will continue to maintain, repair, and preserve these treasures, ensuring that their light, literal and metaphorical, shines for centuries more. If the crown jewels are the shining heart of Britain's monarchy, then the Tower of London is their fortress, a silent stone sentinel over centuries of history. For over 600 years, the tower has housed these treasures, protecting them from theft, fire, and political turmoil. It is not merely a building, it is a guardian of memory. The relationship between the jewels and the tower is almost ritualistic. They were first moved there in the 14th century during the reign of Edward III, and since then, they have rarely left its walls except for coronations and official ceremonies. The tower's White Tower, a Norman keep built nearly a millennium ago, is where gold, gemstones, and the weight of monarchy are kept under constant watch. And watching over them are the yeoman warders, popularly known as the beefeaters. More than ceremonial figures, they have traditionally acted as the first line of defense for the crown jewels. In centuries past, they were responsible for guarding the jewels against theft by ambitious nobles, foreign spies, or even rebels. They carried keys, weapons, and authority, ensuring that the regalia remained untouched, even during the turbulence of civil war, plague, and rebellion. Security has evolved dramatically over time. In medieval England, protection relied on locks, chains, and trusted men. But as history unfolded, threats became more sophisticated. During the 17th century, after the destruction of the original Tudor regalia by parliamentarians, subsequent monarchs understood that both secrecy and physical security were paramount. When the crown jewels were rebuilt, their protection became a blend of craftsmanship and fortress engineering. Cages, thick doors, and hidden compartments became part of their design. In the modern era, security is a highly specialized field. Today, the tower is equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance, alarms, and security personnel, blending centuries-old tradition with modern technology. Yet, tradition still matters. The yeoman warders continue to perform ceremonial duties, leading tourists past the treasures while maintaining a quiet, almost reverential presence. Their role reminds visitors that the jewels are both objects of wonder and symbols of authority. Some moments in history highlight the stakes of their protection. In 1671, a man named Thomas Blood attempted to steal the crown jewels. Blood disguised himself as a clergyman and nearly succeeded in absconding with the regalia, including the St. Edward's crown. His audacious plan failed only through quick thinking and luck, but the event became legendary, a stark reminder that the jewels, no matter how sacred, are always vulnerable. The crown jewels are also political symbols, which makes security not just a matter of theft prevention, but of safeguarding national identity. They represent continuity, authority, and the history of Britain itself. Any damage or loss would be more than financial. It would strike at the nation's sense of itself. Beyond security, the tower functions as a museum and storytelling space. Millions of visitors each year walk past the imperial state crown, the sovereign's scepter, and the ancient coronation swords. They see the jewels not only as glittering treasures, but as tangible fragments of history, victories, defeats, unions, and crises all embedded in gold and gemstones. Through wars, abdications, and coronations, the tower has stood firm. The jewels within it are not static. They are living history, constantly maintained, polished, and occasionally remounted to reflect changing ceremonial needs. The guardianship of the crown jewels, therefore, is more than security. It is a vigilance across centuries, a careful balance between accessibility and protection, spectacle and solemnity. Without this watchful care, the crown, orb, and scepter would be mere artifacts. With it, they remain the enduring heart of Britain's monarchy, brilliant, unbroken, and timeless. The crown jewels of Britain are more than gold and gemstones. They are symbols that live in the collective imagination. Their sparkle is not limited to the Tower of London or coronation ceremonies. It has radiated outward, inspiring art, literature, film, and popular culture for centuries. Long before the age of mass media, artists sought to capture the power of the regalia. Portraits of monarchs almost always featured jewels, diamonds at the throat, crowns upon the brow, scepters in hand. Paintings of Elizabeth I, Victoria, and George VI all emphasize the interplay between ruler and jewel, conveying authority, elegance, and legacy in a single frame. In these works, the gems are more than decoration. They are visual shorthand for monarchy itself. Writers, too, have been drawn to their symbolism. Historical novels and biographies use the crown jewels as motifs to explore power, ambition, and continuity. From the romanticism of Victorian literature to modern novels examining the empire, these jewels often appear as touchstones of legitimacy and desire. They are both coveted and revered, a literary shorthand for authority. In film and television, the crown jewels frequently serve as dramatic focal points. From heist plots that revolve around the tower's treasure to historical dramas depicting coronations, they embody tension, intrigue, and glamour. For instance, movies often portray their glittering allure as irresistible, a metaphor for human ambition and national identity intertwined. Even animated films and documentaries use images of crowns and scepters to signify leadership and destiny. The jewels have also seeped into popular imagination through public exhibitions. Millions of tourists visiting the Tower of London have seen the imperial state crown or the Koh-i-Noor up close, often photographing and sharing the experience worldwide. In doing so, the crown jewels become part of everyday cultural consciousness, objects that connect ordinary people with centuries of history. Fashion and design have borrowed inspiration from the regalia as well. Tiara shapes influence bridal jewelry, brooch patterns are echoed in haute couture, and the brilliance of the diamonds informs jewelry design worldwide. The crown jewels, in effect, have become design icons, merging tradition with contemporary aesthetics. Even music and poetry occasionally reference the jewels, not necessarily in literal terms, but as metaphors for power, permanence, or beauty. Their cultural resonance lies in their duality, at once material and symbolic, tangible yet mythic. They embody the story of Britain's monarchy and its global legacy, while simultaneously inspiring imagination and wonder. And perhaps most importantly, the crown jewels have become a mirror of society itself. They reflect our fascination with history, authority, and beauty. They invite debate about empire, ethics, and heritage, and they provoke admiration, not only for the stones themselves, but for the human stories they have witnessed. In this way, the crown jewels are living cultural artifacts. They do more than sparkle under lights. They illuminate our understanding of monarchy, history, and the human desire for continuity. They remind us that objects, when steeped in centuries of ceremony and memory, can become symbols that transcend their material value. The crown jewels are history in gold, human ambition in diamonds, and memory set in gemstones. And as long as they remain, they will continue to inspire awe, reflection, and imagination across generations. In the 21st century, the British crown jewels continue to shine, but their significance has evolved. They are no longer simply symbols of absolute monarchy or imperial power. They are markers of continuity, identity, and national narrative. Their glitter now carries a message that is as much about heritage and diplomacy as it is about authority. Consider the role of the jewels in state ceremonies today. During the coronation of King Charles III, the St. Edward's crown and imperial state crown were not just ornaments. They were tangible links between past and present. Each gem bore the weight of centuries, the Koh-i-Noor's controversial brilliance, the Cullinan diamond's global origins, the Black Prince's ruby with its medieval history, all serving as silent reminders of the monarchy's endurance. Yet, in contemporary Britain, symbolism matters more than spectacle. The monarchy is no longer about commanding empires, but about representing the nation and its values. The jewels, therefore, function as tools of cultural diplomacy. They are shown to dignitaries, visited by international tourists, and broadcast to billions via television and digital media. Every image of the crown communicates stability, tradition, and a sense of continuity in a fast-changing world. Public perception of the jewels is also more nuanced. Citizens and commentators question their history, their colonial origins, and the ethics of ownership. The Koh-i-Noor remains at the center of debate, and in a globalized world, these conversations have amplified. The jewels now symbolize both pride and reckoning, encouraging reflection on the complexities of Britain's historical narrative. Despite these debates, the jewels retain immense cultural power. They continue to capture the imagination of millions, inspire designers, filmmakers, historians, and artists, and serve as a bridge between generations. Children visiting the Tower of London see a connection to the past that textbooks cannot convey. Adults witness ceremonies that link modern Britain to centuries of tradition. Technology has only increased their influence. High-definition broadcasts, virtual tours, and digital exhibitions allow people around the world to experience the crown jewels in ways unimaginable even 50 years ago. The jewels have moved from private ceremonial objects to global cultural icons, symbols of a monarchy that is increasingly visible and accessible. Moreover, the craftsmanship behind the jewels continues to be celebrated. Modern conservators ensure that crowns, scepters, orbs, and tiaras are not only preserved but prepared for future use. The techniques of centuries, goldsmithing, stone setting, and metalwork, are respected, maintained, and passed down, ensuring that each gem continues to shine as it has for generations. Ultimately, the crown jewels' enduring power lies in their dual nature. They are both material objects and vessels of meaning. They tell stories of conquest and diplomacy, love and loss, continuity and adaptation. They remind us that monarchy is not only about rulers, but about history, identity, and collective memory. In the modern age, where the world is constantly changing, these jewels remain steadfast. They are anchors of tradition, connecting the present to the past and inspiring contemplation about what legacy truly means. Their role is no longer merely ceremonial, it is symbolic, cultural, and moral, a beacon of continuity in a world defined by flux. The crown jewels endure not just for their brilliance, but for their capacity to carry history forward, to illuminate human stories, and to inspire awe in every generation. They are, quite simply, the shimmering heart of Britain's past, present, and future. The crown jewels are more than objects of beauty. They are teachers of history, culture, and human ambition. As we trace their journey through centuries, from the medieval crowns of Edward the Confessor to the gleaming imperial state crown of Elizabeth II, we see not just gemstones and gold, but a reflection of human society itself. First, the jewels remind us that power is symbolic as much as it is practical. A king or queen might rule armies or pass laws, but it is the crown on their head, the scepter in their hand, the orb at their feet that visually communicates authority. For centuries, monarchs understood that images carry power. The crown jewels were designed to impress, to awe, and to assert legitimacy. Lessons in the potency of symbolism that echo across history. Second, the jewels are a testament to global interconnection. Diamonds from India, gold from Africa, sapphires from Sri Lanka. Each gem traces a journey through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. The crown jewels are thus living evidence of the world's intertwined history, showing that even the most nationalistic symbols are inevitably global in origin. They also teach us about adaptation and continuity. Monarchs have risen and fallen, empires have grown and collapsed, yet the jewels endure. During wars, crises, and political upheaval, they were hidden, guarded, and restored. Their survival reminds us that while human institutions may be fragile, the legacies we create can last far longer than any individual life. The jewels carry lessons about ethics and memory as well. Debates surrounding the Koh-i-Noor and other contested treasures show us that history is rarely neutral. Objects hold the weight of human actions, both glorious and unjust. The crown jewels encourage reflection on morality, ownership, and the consequences of power. Reminders that beauty and brilliance cannot erase history. They also illuminate the relationship between art and humanity. Craftsmanship, ingenuity, and aesthetic vision converge in each crown, scepter, and tiara. These objects showcase human skill at its highest level, the ability to transform raw materials into something transcendent. Each gem is not just a mineral, but a story shaped by human hands, imagination, and ambition. Finally, the crown jewels teach us about continuity in the face of change. Societies evolve, politics shift, and generations pass. Yet these jewels remain, linking the present to the past. They remind us that while human lives are fleeting, certain symbols endure, offering perspective, stability, and identity. In essence, the crown jewels are mirrors of humanity. They reflect our desire for beauty, power, permanence, and legacy. They reveal our triumphs, our mistakes, and our ambitions. They teach us that history is not just a record of events, but a tapestry of human decisions, emotions, and dreams, all refracted through gold and gemstone. To study the crown jewels is to study the human story itself, our empires, our artistry, our morality, and our longing to leave a mark upon the world. In their sparkle, we see centuries of human hope, hubris, and devotion. In their weight, we feel the burden of history, and in their endurance, we find a lesson that transcends monarchy, that beauty, meaning, and legacy can shine across generations, if only we care to preserve them. The crown jewels are not just the property of a monarchy or a nation. They are shared symbols of humanity's ambition, creativity, and memory. And as long as they endure, so too does the story they tell, a story of power, art, and the indomitable human spirit. After centuries of creation, war, debate, and ceremony, the crown jewels remain one of Britain's most iconic legacies. Their importance extends far beyond the shimmer of gold and diamonds. They are touchstones of history, culture, and identity, not only for the United Kingdom, but for the world that has watched, admired, and questioned their meaning. At their core, the jewels embody continuity. Every coronation, every jubilee, every public display reminds citizens and observers alike that the monarchy, while adapting to modern times, is rooted in centuries of tradition. The St. Edward's crown, the imperial state crown, the sovereign's scepter. These are not merely ceremonial objects, they are symbols of resilience, linking the present to a long and complex history. But their significance is not static. In the 21st century, the crown jewels also represent dialogue, a dialogue between past and present, between history and morality. Debates over colonial provenance, contested treasures like the Koh-i-Noor, and the ethics of display highlight that the jewels are living artifacts. They invite society to re-examine history, to ask difficult questions about empire, power, and cultural ownership. The jewels also inspire human creativity. Artisans, jewelers, and designers study them not only for technique, but for inspiration. Their forms, motifs, and symbolism resonate through fashion, design, literature, and media. They remind us that beauty is never merely aesthetic. It carries meaning, communicates authority, and tells stories across generations. On a personal and emotional level, the crown jewels connect people to shared memory and identity. Millions of visitors flock to the Tower of London each year to see the crowns and scepters. Television broadcasts, documentaries, and images allow billions more to experience them virtually. They are collective symbols, objects that belong simultaneously to the monarchy, the nation, and the imagination of the world. Moreover, the jewels remind us that history is alive. They witness triumphs and tragedies, marriages and abdications, wars and jubilees. Each scratch, each repair, and each setting reflects a human story. The ambitions of kings, the choices of queens, the ingenuity of artisans, and the vigilance of guardians. They are living archives, recording centuries of human endeavour in gold and gemstone. Ultimately, the crown jewels teach us about balance. They are a fusion of power and artistry, tradition and adaptation, symbolism and practicality. They remind us that heritage is not only about preservation, but also about reflection, responsibility, and understanding. They show that the objects we treasure are more than material. They are vessels of meaning, connecting generations, nations, and cultures. As we look to the future, the jewels will continue to glimmer as reminders. They will crown new monarchs, witness new ceremonies, and spark new debates. They will be studied, admired, and contested, as they always have been. And through it all, they will endure, shining not only as symbols of monarchy, but as testaments to humanity's capacity for beauty, ambition, and memory. In the end, the crown jewels are not just royal possessions. They are mirrors of human history, keepers of culture, and witnesses to the stories that shape nations and the world. Their importance lies not just in what they are made of, but in what they represent. The enduring human desire to create, to remember, and to leave a legacy that outshines time itself. And that is why royal jewelry, the crowns, the scepters, the orbs, and the gems, matters, because it is history made tangible, heritage made visible, and memory made luminous for Britain and for the world.